A few years ago, Ines was imprisoned and facing charges for the murder and disappearance of Clara, a young girl who was only 5 years old at the time of the crime and the daughter of Renato Faria, the sole judge of a medium-sized town in the countryside. Because of this, she risked being sentenced to life imprisonment. During the trial, Renato himself conducted the court proceedings, but no one expected the reality to be so harsh. After the truth came to light on a cloudy afternoon, Ines's trial for the disappearance and murder of little Clara turned into a spectacle, attracting the attention of the entire town with the intensity of a television drama. The daily headlines painted Ines not just as guilty but as a heartless monster, capturing the public's imagination and disdain. Newspapers and news channels competed to provide the most sensationalist coverage possible, often at the expense of the truth itself. Inside the overcrowded courtroom, the tension was palpable every day of the trial. The galleries were filled with curious onlookers and activists, some calling for justice, others just seeking entertainment. Judge Renato, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, repeatedly struck his gavel, trying to maintain order amidst the constant murmuring. "Order in the court," he commanded, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "The session is about to begin." At the defense table, Ines, who had been in pre-trial detention for a few years, sat with an upright posture, her eyes fixed on the judge as he prepared to make his opening remarks. Beside her, the defense attorney, Dr. Giovanna, leafed through her papers with apparent calm, though her eyes revealed the tension she felt. Dr. Leandro, the prosecution attorney, was a charismatic man with a magnetic presence that dominated the room. He stood up and walked slowly to the jury, pausing dramatically before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have before us is a crime so malicious, so devoid of humanity, that it shocks the conscience of our community. How can anyone look into the eyes of an innocent child and," said Dr. Leandro before pausing. His voice trailed off into a dramatic silence, staring directly at Ines, as if daring her to interrupt him. Ines kept her head held high, her eyes gleaming with determination. She knew that every word from the prosecution was calculated to condemn her in the jury's eyes, before any evidence was even presented. She felt the weight of everyone's gaze in the room, judging her even before the final verdict. Clara was a lively girl, loved by everyone who knew her, the attorney continued, his voice laden with emotion. "And now her family and this community demand justice. Judge Renato, for everything he has done for our town, deserves justice, and it is our duty to ensure that justice is served." Dr. Leandro turned to the jury, his eyes narrowing with intensity. "Throughout this trial, you will hear testimonies and see evidence that will reveal the true nature of the crime committed. And I ask you to look beyond appearances and seek the truth." With that, the prosecution attorney concluded his opening statement. On the other side of the room, the defense attorney, Dr. Giovanna, rose slowly, adjusting her glasses before addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began with a calm and controlled voice, "what we will see here is not just a search for the truth, but also a fight against prejudice and misinformation. My client, Ines, is suffering an unfair attack from the media and public opinion, but I ask you to consider the facts carefully, to listen to all the evidence before reaching any conclusions." Dr. Giovanna looked at each member of the jury, trying to establish a connection. "Ines is innocent until proven otherwise, and I believe that by the end of this trial, the truth will come to light, and she will be acquitted." The room was silent as the defense attorney's words hung in the air. Judge Renato, watching attentively, gave a slight nod, indicating that the trial could proceed with the first witness being called to the stand. Everyone knew that the coming days would be intense and charged with emotions. Ines's fate was at stake, every detail and every testimony could make the difference between freedom and conviction. Thus began the trial that would keep the town full of expectations about a battle not just for justice, but for truth amid chaos and misinformation. In the following days, protest groups gathered daily in front of the courthouse, armed with signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Clara" and "Out with Inés." Interviews with the demonstrators frequently appeared on the news, further fueling the atmosphere of a public trial. "She doesn't deserve compassion," said a woman with an inflamed look to the camera. "She stole the life of a child. Justice must be served." In this charged environment, social media buzzed with debates and theories about the case, many repeating the baseless accusations circulated by the press. For this reason, it fell to Inés's defense, represented by Dr. Giovanna, to undertake the difficult task of turning the tide of public opinion. When approached by the press, she stated in an interview with the city's main newspaper, "What truly shocks the conscience, ladies and gentlemen, is how easily we forget one of the pillars of our justice system, the presumption of innocence. As I said at the start of the trial, my client was judged by the media and condemned by public opinion even before setting foot in this courtroom." On the streets, opinion about Inés was polarized but predominantly negative. The faces turned against her were a constant reminder of the mountain the defense would have to climb to achieve justice. On a cloudy afternoon, after another tense day in court, Giovanna walked to her office, avoiding the reproachful looks of trial spectators. The newspapers at the stands displayed sensationalist headlines highlighting every morbid detail of Clara's case. She felt the weight of the pressure on her shoulders as she entered the cold building of the courthouse. Upon opening her office door, she found Inés sitting at the table, surrounded by piles of documents and newspaper clippings. Her expression was a mix of determination and exhaustion. "Inés," Giovanna began, closing the door behind her, "how are you coping with all of this?" Inés looked up to meet her gaze, her tired face reflecting deep sadness. "It's hard, Giovanna. It's like I'm fighting the entire world. They've already condemned me." Giovanna slowly approached and sat in front of Inés, choosing her words carefully. "We knew it would be an arduous battle. But I still believe in our defense. We have evidence and testimonies that can change everything." Inés agreed, a flicker of hope appearing in her eyes. "I trust you, Giovanna. I just hope the jury can see beyond the lies being spread." Giovanna placed her hand over Inés's, conveying silent support. "They will see, Inés. We will prove your innocence, no matter what it takes." Time was running out, but Giovanna knew there was still a chance. She would return to the courtroom the next day, ready to confront the judge and challenge each accusation with the power of facts and truth. However, Inés's image had already been distorted and transformed from a woman into a ruthless monster, being condemned not by evidence but by a narrative built to sell newspapers and increase the ratings of sensationalist television channels. As Inés sat in the defendant's chair, absorbing every word spoken, a feeling of isolation enveloped her. She knew the chances of a fair trial were diminishing with each passing day, as collective hysteria clouded the case's facts. Amidst the noise and condemnation, she clung to the only thing she had left, the truth about her innocence. In court, Judge Renato was determined to maintain pressure on Inés and make her pay for his daughter's murder. It was no secret that Dr. Leandro, the prosecution attorney, was entirely biased by the judge's opinion, which even violated the principles of legal ethics. However, the power of being the town's only judge prevented the case from being transferred to another court, where Inés might receive a fairer trial. One day, amid the trial, Dr. Leandro addressed the jury with sharp words, painting a grim picture of a woman who deserved no mercy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice echoing through the courtroom, "what we have here is not just a brutal murder but an act of pure cruelty. Ines not only took the life of an innocent child but also tried to cover up her crime and deceive all of us here. The courtroom's eyes turned to Ines, some with disgust, others with doubt. She could feel the weight of the accusations against her, and each word from the attorney brought her closer to a seemingly certain sentence. On the other side of the room, Dr. Giovanna was ready to face the prosecution against her client. She stood up with determination and fixed her gaze on the jury as she began her argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Giovanna began firmly, "what Dr. Leandro presents are conjectures based on a sensationalist narrative. There is no concrete evidence linking my client to this crime. What we have is a desperate attempt to find a scapegoat for a terrible tragedy." She looked directly at Ines, conveying confidence through her gaze. Ines is a woman being judged not by facts, but by public opinion. We have evidence that demonstrates her innocence, and that is what we will prove. Days turned into weeks, and each court session was like a new chapter of a relentless drama. Outside the courthouse, journalists eagerly awaited any development that could intensify the sensation surrounding Ines's case. Social media continued to buzz with heated debates and divided opinions about Ines's guilt or innocence. Meanwhile, inside the cold courtroom walls, Ines maintained her composure despite the constant pressure. She trusted Dr. Giovanna, who fought tirelessly by her side, and hoped that the truth would finally come to light. Ines remained an enigmatic figure of serenity, a living contrast to the collective hysteria that had taken over the town. Her behavior in court, marked by unwavering calm, intrigued everyone from the judge to the journalists covering every moment of the trial. One particularly tense afternoon, after a parade of circumstantial evidence presented by the prosecution, Dr. Giovanna once again found herself in her office with Ines. Her expression was laden with concern. "Ines, we need you to speak, to tell your version of the facts. Silence only fuels speculation. We can dismantle the accusations with the truth," said the attorney. Ines looked at Giovanna, her eyes reflecting a mix of resignation and determination. She knew the time would come to speak and confront the accusations head-on, but she wasn't ready yet. "Giovanna, I trust you," Ines began, her voice calm, echoing through the empty office after the long day in court. "But if I speak, they will judge me not by the truth, but by the emotions they want to see in me. They want a show and to see me in ruins." Giovanna nodded, understanding, sitting beside Ines. "I understand how you feel, but we need to show the jury who you really are, to show your humanity and sincerity. We can't let their narrative prevail." Ines lowered her gaze for a moment, lost in thought. The trial's pressure weighed on her, not just because of the possible conviction, but because of how her life had been publicly exposed. "I feel like I no longer know who I truly am," Ines admitted in a whisper. "They've painted a picture of me that I don't even recognize." Giovanna placed a comforting hand on Ines's shoulder. "You are more than the stories they tell about you. You are a person with your own story, and we will fight to ensure that story is heard." However, Ines remained steadfast, looking directly into the attorney's eyes with a clarity that seemed to transcend the office walls. "No matter what I say," she responded in a low voice, but with a quiet strength, "the truth I carry defies what they want to believe. My words would be just another whisper in the windstorm of their convictions." Intrigued and frustrated, the attorney insisted. "But the truth is the foundation of justice. We must trust that the truth will prevail, despite the odds." Ines smiled faintly, not out of disdain, but from a deep understanding born from her journey. "The truth is just a detail in times of injustice. It stays with me even when the world turns against me. In this truth, I find my peace, not in the acquittal they might offer." Even in the face of her attorney's insistence, Ines chose the path of silent dignity, facing the looks of doubt and judgment with a posture that defied explanation. That night, Ines could barely sleep. She reviewed every detail of her life, trying to find a way to show the world who she really was. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Clara's face, the girl whose life was tragically cut short, and felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. In the following days, as the trial neared its conclusion, the courtroom atmosphere became even more charged. The prosecution presented its final witnesses, each reinforcing the narrative of guilt they had meticulously built. The jury listened attentively, some with tears in their eyes, while Judge Renato, deeply involved in the plot of his daughter's loss, skillfully guided the testimony to maximize the emotional impact. On the other side, Giovanna watched with a serious expression, taking timely notes for her next argument. When it was the defense's turn to present its case, Giovanna called her own witnesses, each offering a different perspective on Ines's personality and the events leading to the tragedy. Friends and coworkers described her as a kind and helpful person, incapable of such a terrible act as the one being described in court. The day Ines finally took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She faced the jury with serenity, her eyes seeking understanding and empathy in the expressions of those who would decide her fate. Her calm was not a surrender, but a declaration of inner strength, a refusal to be shaken by the storms around her. This mystery surrounding her tranquility only heightened the fascination. How can she remain so calm? Reporters wondered in their news segments. What secret is she hiding behind her silence? For Ines, however, this serenity was not a calculated strategy, it was a refuge, a space of clarity amid the chaos that allowed her to face the future with her head held high. She invoked her right to remain silent in all questioning, as public opinion and the media had already influenced the jury entirely. As the trial moved into its final phases, the courtroom atmosphere became even tenser. Closing arguments were made, each side trying to persuade the jury with their opposing versions of what happened on the fateful night Clara disappeared. With precise eloquence, Dr. Giovanna highlighted the inconsistencies in the evidence presented by the prosecution. She appealed to the jury not to be swayed by emotion and media judgment but by reason and facts pointing to Ines's innocence. On the other side of this room is a woman being judged not by her actions but by a narrative constructed around her, Giovanna said, her voice echoing through the courtroom. I ask you to look beyond the sensationalist headlines and unfounded speculations. I ask you to look at the truth. As the jurors retired to deliberate, Ines waited with an outward calm, though inside her heart was pounding with anxiety. She trusted the defense Giovanna had carefully built, but knew that her life's fate was now in the hands of strangers. Hours passed before the jury returned, their serious faces revealing the tension of the moment. Ines held her breath as the verdict was announced. In the case of Ines, accused of the homicide of Clara Faria, the jury finds her. At that moment, the door opened, and the Minister of Justice, a personal friend of the president, ordered the trial to be stopped. Halt the trial immediately. The sentence should not be delivered now, he said, leaving everyone shocked. Ines looked at Dr. Giovanna, not understanding what was happening, as tears filled her eyes. Due to the significant media attention, the high political power became aware of the case and was pressured about the unconstitutionality of Judge Renato's actions since he was the father of the girl. From now on, I will personally take over Ines's trial. This should not influence the jury's decision in any way, but it is unacceptable for this sentence to be delivered by someone so involved in the case as Judge Renato Faria. There is evident bias here, the minister continued before finally concluding his speech. Tomorrow, under my command, the sentence will be delivered. The trial is now suspended. At that moment, the courtroom fell into absolute silence, while the minister's words echoed in the air. Each of them was like a bomb for both Ines and everyone else present. Returning to the cold and somber cell she had called home for the past few years, Ines reflected that she had gained one more day before her likely life sentence. For her, that day came with oppressive quiet, like the calm before the storm. As the night deepened, her thoughts swirled around distant memories, shattered dreams, and a future that would never be. It was in this moment of desolation that Judge Renato appeared, as if to check on the very hand of fate descending upon her. Even after the minister's intervention, Renato wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He then entered the cell, his imposing figure silhouetted against the dim corridor light. "Ines," he began, his voice carrying a calculated coldness, "I thought I'd come to see how you spend your last hours before ensuring you spend the rest of your life in prison. I think it's quite educational." Ines, slowly rising, faced him with a mix of surprise and disgust. "Did you come to mock me, Renato? To watch up close the suffering you helped create? Mock?" Renato let out a laugh of contempt. "No, Ines. I came because I wanted you to know that I won. Your pain, a lifetime in prison, is my revenge." Ines stiffened at the judge's cutting words. She had faced many battles during the years of trial, but facing Renato on the eve of her execution was a final act of cruelty. "Revenge?" she murmured, her eyes locked onto his. "You call this justice, Renato?" "I call justice the enforcement of the law," Renato retorted, his voice echoing coldly in the cell. "You were judged by the court, and tomorrow you will be condemned for your actions. It doesn't matter if the sentence comes from me or the Minister of Justice. Justice is being served." Ines stepped back, feeling the weight of reality closing in on her. She knew her defense had fought with all their might, but the facts and public opinion had sealed her fate. "I didn't kill Clara, and you know it," Ines said firmly, her voice resonating with a determination that even surprised herself. "But if that's what you need to believe to justify all this..." Renato stepped closer, looking down at her. "Believe what you want, Ines. The truth is, you'll be alone with your thoughts tonight, and don't forget that the rest of your nights will be like this, inside a cell." "Do you think this hurts me, Renato? I'm already used to it, but you will have to live with what you've done and the lies you've told." "That's worse than any sentence," Ines said proudly. Renato approached the bars, his gaze hardening. "Don't underestimate the depth of my hatred, Ines. Your hatred only shows what you really are, Renato. You may have put me in prison forever, but you'll never erase the truth. The truth lives on, while your lie will die with you," she replied. For a moment, Renato seemed to waver as if Ines's words had struck his heart. However, he composed himself again, his face closing off once more in a mask of disdain. "Enjoy this night, Ines, because the next ones will drag on ever slower until you rot in prison." With those final words, Renato turned and left, leaving Ines alone with her thoughts and the starless night. The cell became a place of shadows and silence, where Ines faced not only the reality of her condemnation but the injustice that had haunted her from the beginning. She lay on her narrow bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, lost in reflections about her life and what it could have been if things had been different. She relived every moment of the trial, every accusatory look, and every distorted testimony that had sealed her fate. Before falling asleep in the middle of the night, Ines was awakened by a guard who came to bring her a simple meal. He barely looked at Ines as he slid the tray through the bars. She had no appetite, but she knew she needed to eat for the next day. "Aren't you afraid of spending the rest of your life in prison?" the guard suddenly asked, surprising Ines with his direct question. Afraid? She repeated, looking at him with a calm expression. I've already faced the worst. There's nothing more to fear. The guard nodded as if her answer puzzled him. He walked away in silence, leaving Ines alone again with her dark thoughts. Time seemed to lose its meaning in that cell. Every second dragged painfully as Ines prepared for the inevitable. She didn't know what it would be like to spend the rest of her life in prison, but she was determined to face her fate with the same dignity she had maintained throughout the trial. As the night gave way to dawn, Ines closed her eyes and plunged into a silent prayer, seeking strength not only for herself but for those who had believed in her despite everything. The judge's visit the night before her sentencing brought neither comfort nor resolution, but only a cruel reminder of betrayal and loss. However, it also reinforced a new determination in Ines to prove her innocence, refusing to let Renato's hatred define the rest of her life. The next day, before a courtroom once again packed, a heavy silence hung in the air, dense as fog. Prison staff, journalists with special permission, and a small group of curious onlookers and local authorities filled the space. Their expressions ranged from morbid anticipation to evident discomfort. The tension was almost palpable, as if everyone present shared a collective breath, awaiting the final resolution of the drama that had captured the nation's attention. Ines, with her wrists and ankles shackled, was led to the defense table beside Dr. Giovanna. Her steps were firm, and her posture, as always, confident despite the weight of the chains. She faced the silent audience with a serenity that contrasted with the charged environment. The Minister of Justice made a discreet gesture, and the room plunged into an even deeper silence. It was as if the world was suspended, awaiting the final verdict of justice. Ines directed her gaze to the small group comprising the jury before her eyes briefly met Dr. Giovanna's. A subtle nod, laden with gratitude and resignation, passed between them before Ines turned her attention back to the chair in front of her. The formalities were completed, and the trial was about to resume. Ines heard the distant murmur of voices around her, but her mind was focused on a distant place, beyond the walls that enclosed her. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength for what was to come next. The curious looks and camera flashes faded to the periphery of her consciousness. The moment was approaching, and it was inevitable to face it. She took a deep breath, seeking the peace she had found in the silence of her solitary cell many times before. Despite the tension in the air, Ines's face emanated a defiant serenity. Her eyes began to sweep the room several times, registering every detail and every face present, until they settled on Renato, who, contrary to his usual confident posture in the judge's chair, appeared restless as a spectator. The Minister of Justice finally took the floor. I declare the trial resumed. Today, we will finally hear the verdict on the conviction or acquittal of Ines, accused of the murder of little Clara. At that moment, Ines thought the battle was already lost and that it had all been just a formality to ensure the sentence was not decided by Renato, who, as the judge in the case and father of the murdered girl, was too biased to determine her sentence, which would open the door for annulment. However, to her surprise, the minister addressed her directly, saying, Ines, I realize you haven't adequately defended yourself, perhaps because you felt pressured by Judge Renato's presence throughout the trial. Do you have anything to say before I proceed with the jury's decision? He said, leaving everyone speechless. Yes, I do, and what I'm about to say could change everything, Ines declared. Everyone in the room leaned in, and a murmur of surprise ran through the audience. Even Renato seemed to hold his breath, a shadow of worry crossing his face. Ines continued, her eyes fixed on Renato's. For a long time, I've carried the weight of a secret I couldn't reveal, a secret that could have changed the course of this trial from the beginning. The minister looked at Renato, who now seemed utterly bewildered. The murmurs in the room grew louder, echoing the suspense that spread like smoke. Ines pinned the word in the charged air. I didn't kill Clara. I never even hurt her, and my connection with her goes far beyond what you can imagine. A chill ran through the room. Cameras flashed, capturing Renato's stunned expression. The minister stood up, his firm voice cutting through the growing tumult. Order in the court. Explain yourself, ma'am. Ines shot a quick glance at her attorney, Giovanna, whose eyes shone with a mix of shock and hope. Clara didn't die the way it was reported, Ines continued, her words filled with intensity. She's alive. The ensuing silence was deafening. The room's occupants, from the prison staff to the journalists, could hardly believe what they had just heard. Renato was pale, his lips parted in absolute shock. The minister struck the gavel, demanding silence once more, before fixing his gaze on Ines. Are you saying Clara is alive? Tell the truth once and for all. Ines looked around, seeing the incredulity etched on every face in the courtroom. She took another deep breath, gathering her strength to reveal the truth she had kept hidden for so long, a truth that could finally free her from the shadow of unjust condemnation. Clara didn't die that day, as I said, she began, her voice echoing firmly in the room. She was taken away in secret. I know who took her and why. The Minister of Justice raised an eyebrow. His interest was now entirely captured by the surprising twist in events. The room was in absolute silence, with all attention focused on Ines's words, the final unraveling of a story that had begun with such drama and tragedy. Ines looked once more directly into Renato's eyes, her expression a blend of compassion and calm that contrasted with the turmoil around her. I am Clara's mother, Ines announced, with an intensity that reverberated through the room's walls. A collective shock was palpable, as if time had stopped. Despite Judge Renato painting himself as a victim of his daughter's death, he didn't seem to care about blaming the girl's mother for his own wrongdoings. Renato stood up abruptly, and his chair creaked under the sudden movement. This is absurd. She's trying to manipulate the system, he shouted at the Minister of Justice, trying to control the narrative, but his voice had a slight tremor. Ines continued, ignoring the interruption. She's with her grandparents, in a place you call hell, isn't she, Renato? She said before also turning to the minister. Check it out before it's too late. Renato, now deeply disturbed, tried to formulate a response, but Ines left no room for interruptions. Renato's grandparents have been caring for Clara since she disappeared. They've kept her hidden, away from the world's eyes, but very well cared for, even though the girl can't move her legs. Ines paused, and the room now remained in absolute silence, as no one believed her words. Renato needed to hide what he did to his own daughter after crashing the car and condemning her to a wheelchair. That's why he was so determined to incriminate me and always hid that I was the mother of his child. The Minister of Justice, now deeply intrigued, intervened with authority. Ms. Ines, prove immediately what you're talking about. This is a serious matter and cannot be used for games or tricks. Ines looked directly into the minister's eyes, her expression grave and determined. I am not joking, Your Honor. From the beginning, I knew there was something wrong with the narrative that culminated in this trial, but the media condemned me in such a way that I didn't even know how to defend myself. Clara didn't die, she was merely kidnapped, and not by me. Renato has been hiding this for years. The journalists in the room were frantic, and the cameras captured every word spoken by Ines as the truth began to unfold before them. The minister raised his hand, calling for silence in the room. These are serious accusations, Ms. Ines, and you are just circling around the same point. We need proof. Ines agreed, her mind now clear and focused on the minister's request. Renato's phone surely has the coordinates of the place where she's hidden. I even know the address of his grandparents' house. However, I need your word, your honor, that she will be protected and removed from the hell where she is trapped. The room erupted into chaos. The murmurs grew louder, everyone trying to assimilate the implications of this twist. Giovanna, Ines's attorney, acting quickly, stepped forward. I demand an immediate suspension of this trial. There is new evidence that needs to be investigated. Renato, now visibly shaken, tried to maintain his facade of indignation. She's lying. This is a desperate trick. However, the seed of doubt had already been planted. The Minister of Justice, with a now gravely serious expression, declared, "The trial is suspended. We will investigate this allegation immediately." The room fell silent as the Minister of Justice considered his next words. It was an unexpected twist, a moment that could rewrite not only Ines's story but also Clara's fate. The Minister of Justice then continued, "I will issue an order immediately to investigate these allegations. Ms. Ines, you will be kept in custody until the truth is confirmed. If your words prove true, I promise your sentence will be reviewed. Renato will remain under judicial supervision until his innocence is proven." The minister then turned to Renato, "And if convicted, you know very well what your fate will be after so many years of hammering down the gavel in this courtroom, don't you?" Still stunned and furious, Renato was escorted out of the room while the investigation was prepared. Ines remained seated for a few moments, her heart pounding. As Ines was removed from the courtroom, the look she exchanged with Giovanna was one of intensity that only the keenest observers noticed. It was a look that said much without words. The truth was finally beginning to crack the surface of lies built over years. Ines's revelation not only interrupted the trial but also opened up a sea of possibilities that could completely redefine the case. The fates of Ines, Clara, and even Renato were now hanging by a thread of uncertainties. In the following days, an intensive investigation was launched to find Clara and verify the veracity of Ines's allegations. Social media and newspapers buzzed with debates and theories about the case, while lawyers on both sides prepared for the legal developments. Renato, now publicly shamed, tried to reaffirm his position as a judge while facing incisive questions about his conduct in the case. Meanwhile, the allegation that Clara was alive and hidden with Renato's grandparents turned the case upside down. The tension was palpable as the public awaited news of crucial developments that could change everything. Ines was transferred to a new temporary cell and kept under strict security. Giovanna worked tirelessly to ensure her client was protected and that the truth would come to light. Days later, in a surprising twist, Clara's grandparents were located. Police teams were immediately sent to the isolated farm Ines had mentioned. Upon arrival, they found a surprising scene: Clara, now 10 years old, playing in the garden under the watchful eye of an elderly couple who identified themselves as the girl's great-grandparents. The great-grandfather explained, his voice trembling, "My grandson Renato brought Clara to us 5 years ago, saying her mother had been involved in a terrible accident and it was dangerous for Clara to stay in the city." The discovery was met with a mix of relief and indignation as Clara was carefully examined by medical professionals to ensure her well-being. Renato was summoned to provide explanations. His version of events was confronted with the evidence found on the farm, and his defensive attitude began to crumble as the facts unfolded. Days later, an extraordinary hearing was convened to review Ines's case. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation and tension. Ines, now dressed in civilian clothes and with a determined expression, sat next to her attorney, Giovanna. The room was filled with journalists hungry for details and Ines's supporters clamoring for justice. The Minister of Justice began this session with a solemn tone. This court has been convened to consider new evidence presented by Ines's defense, which alleges a severe manipulation of evidence and unethical conduct by Judge Renato. His voice echoed through the room, capturing everyone's attention. Giovanna stood, her eyes fixed on the judge. Your Honor, the new evidence reveals that Clara is not only alive but was kept secret by her own father and the judge in this case, Renato. Not only did he conceal crucial information from this court, but he also manipulated testimonies and evidence to unjustly convict my client. Renato, visibly tense and pale, tried to interrupt. This is absurd. I acted in the best interest of justice to protect Clara from imminent danger. I merely took measures to protect her. The minister raised his hand to silence Renato. You will have the opportunity to explain yourself, Renato. First, we will hear all the evidence presented by the defense. For hours, testimonies were heard, documents examined, and the words of Clara's great-grandparents were crucial in revealing the truth. Renato's story began to crumble before everyone's eyes as his conduct was rigorously condemned. At the end of the day, the minister spoke again. His expression was grave, reflecting the seriousness of the moment. Based on the new evidence presented, this court determines that there was severe manipulation of justice by Judge Renato Faria, violating the principles of law and ethics in this country. Ines, you are officially cleared of the charges of Clara's disappearance and alleged murder. A collective sigh filled the room, followed by restrained applause from Ines's supporters. Renato, sitting in the defendant's chair, was pale and motionless. His mind struggled to process what had just happened. The legal battle was far from over, but for Ines, that moment represented more than just acquittal. It was the redemption of a woman who faced injustice head-on, proof that the truth, though late, prevails. In turn, the discovery was a devastating blow to Renato's defense. The evidence was irrefutable, and his plot, built on a castle of lies, began to collapse. Back in the interrogation, the minister confronted Renato with the new evidence. Renato, your daughter was found alive with your grandparents, exactly where Ines said she would be. The minister crossed his arms, his gaze fixed and incisive. Renato, realizing the game was over, lowered his head, his expression finally collapsing. I just wanted to protect my career, Minister. I didn't know what else to do. If I were detained for drunk driving, I would lose everything and could never justify how Clara ended up in a wheelchair without exposing the accident. Days later, in a surprising twist, Clara's grandparents were located. Police teams were immediately sent to the isolated farm Ines had mentioned. Upon arrival, they found a surprising scene: Clara, now 10 years old, playing in the garden under the watchful eye of an elderly couple who identified themselves as the girl's great-grandparents. The great-grandfather explained, his voice trembling, "My grandson Renato brought Clara to us 5 years ago, saying her mother had been involved in a terrible accident and it was dangerous for Clara to stay in the city." The discovery was met with a mix of relief and indignation as Clara was carefully examined by medical professionals to ensure her well-being. Renato was summoned to provide explanations. His version of events was confronted with the evidence found on the farm, and his defensive attitude began to crumble as the facts unfolded. Days later, an extraordinary hearing was convened to review Ines's case. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation and tension. Ines, now dressed in civilian clothes and with a determined expression, sat next to her attorney, Giovanna. The room was filled with journalists hungry for details and Inés's supporters clamoring for justice. The Minister of Justice began this session with a solemn tone. This court has been convened to consider new evidence presented by Inés's defense, which alleges a severe manipulation of evidence and unethical conduct by Judge Renato. His voice echoed through the room, capturing everyone's attention. Giovanna stood, her eyes fixed on the judge. Your Honor, the new evidence reveals that Clara is not only alive but was kept secret by her own father and the judge in this case, Renato. Not only did he conceal crucial information from this court, but he also manipulated testimonies and evidence to unjustly convict my client. Renato, visibly tense and pale, tried to interrupt. This is absurd. I acted in the best interest of justice to protect Clara from imminent danger. I merely took measures to protect her. The minister raised his hand to silence Renato. You will have the opportunity to explain yourself, Renato. First, we will hear all the evidence presented by the defense. For hours, testimonies were heard, documents examined, and the words of Clara's great-grandparents were crucial in revealing the truth. Renato's story began to crumble before everyone's eyes as his conduct was rigorously condemned. At the end of the day, the minister spoke again. His expression was grave, reflecting the seriousness of the moment. Based on the new evidence presented, this court determines that there was severe manipulation of justice by Judge Renato Faria, violating the principles of law and ethics in this country. Inés, you are officially cleared of the charges of Clara's disappearance and alleged murder. A collective sigh filled the room, followed by restrained applause from Inés's supporters. Renato, sitting in the defendant's chair, was pale and motionless. His mind struggled to process what had just happened. The legal battle was far from over, but for Inés, that moment represented more than just acquittal. It was the redemption of a woman who faced injustice head-on, proof that the truth, though late, prevails. In turn, the discovery was a devastating blow to Renato's defense. The evidence was irrefutable, and his plot, built on a castle of lies, began to collapse. Back in the interrogation, the minister confronted Renato with the new evidence. Renato, your daughter was found alive with your grandparents, exactly where Inés said she would be. The minister crossed his arms, his gaze fixed and incisive. Renato, realizing the game was over, lowered his head, his expression finally collapsing. I just wanted to protect my career, Minister. I didn't know what else to do. If I were detained for drunk driving, I would lose everything and could never justify how Clara ended up in a wheelchair without exposing the accident. Thank you for your company. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what you thought of the story. See you next time.